There is a story the big banks and the financial channels would rather you never sat down and really thought about. Not because it is complicated, because it is simple. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. The number in the title of this video is one they want you to laugh at. They want you to file it under fantasy, under the ravings of people who keep metal in a safe and mutter about the end of the world. I am going to ask you to do the opposite. I am going to ask you to take it seriously for the next 20 minutes, calmly, the way a grown adult looks at a fact instead of flinching from it. Because if you are sitting on a lifetime of savings, a retirement account you spent decades quietly filling, money you cannot afford to be wrong about, then the question of whether silver is wildly overpriced or quietly, almost absurdly cheap is not some academic parlor game to you. It is your future. It is what your money will be worth when you actually need to spend it. And by the time we are done here, you are going to understand why a number that sounds outrageous today rests on a piece of American law older than almost everything else in your life. So let me give you the fact that most people never start with, the one that reframes this whole conversation. When this country wrote its very first money law, back when the Republic itself was brand new, it set the value of silver against gold at close to 15 to 1. 15 ounces of silver to 1 ounce of gold. That was not a wild guess pulled out of the air by a handful of politicians in wigs. It was drawn from centuries of how those two metals had actually traded across empires and kingdoms and continents for as long as human beings had used them as money at all. For most of recorded history, that relationship lived somewhere in that neighborhood, roughly a dozen to a couple dozen ounces of silver for a single ounce of gold. That was the natural order of things. Now hold that in your mind, 15 to 1. Then understand this. Today, the ratio between the two metals is nowhere near that. It is stretched, pulled wide, sitting far above where the founders of this country and thousands of years of merchants before them believed the natural balance was. And when I say the ratio is wide, I mean silver is cheap relative to gold. That is what the ratio measures. When it takes many more ounces of silver to buy a single ounce of gold than history ever thought was normal, silver is on sale, deeply on sale. And almost nobody is telling you that in plain language, because the people who move this market for a living make their money on your confusion, not your clarity. Think about that for a moment. The one measure that would tell an ordinary saver the metal is cheap is the one measure the financial channels almost never put in front of you. That is not an accident. Silence in a market is a strategy. Let me make sure that mechanism is crystal clear, because it is the spine of everything else. The gold to silver ratio is just one number divided by another. How many ounces of silver does it take to equal the price of 1 ounce of gold? When that number is small, silver is expensive relative to gold. When that number is large, silver is cheap relative to gold. For 2 centuries of American history, and long before it, the number hovered near that old 15 to 1 anchor. In the modern era, it has drifted higher, and it swings. But right now, it sits well up in the range it has occupied over the last several decades, closer to the wide end than the narrow end. Which is another way of saying silver, measured against its ancient partner, is trading at a discount that the long sweep of history would call unusual. Why did that old ratio hold for so long? Because it was not arbitrary. The two metals come out of the ground at nowhere near the spread the market now assigns them. Silver is more common in the Earth's crust than gold, yes, but only by something in that same historic neighborhood, not by the enormous multiple the screen prints today. For most of human history, the price roughly tracked the scarcity. That is what money made of metal does. It finds a natural level. The stretch we live in now, this modern gap that is far wider than 15 to 1, is not the natural order reasserting itself. It is a distortion. And distortions, if you know anything about markets, do not last forever. So sit with the shape of that. The distance between where the ratio is now and where it sat for the majority of recorded history is enormous. If silver were merely to drift partway back toward its old relationship with gold, and gold simply held near the elevated levels it has already reached, silver would not need a miracle to move dramatically higher. It would only need history to stop being ignored. That is the quiet arithmetic underneath the number in the title. Not a prophecy, not a promise. A ratio that is stretched to an extreme, and a long history that says these stretches tend to close. And here's where I have to name the thing directly, because you deserve honesty. The big trading desks, the the bullion banks, the financial media that treats gold and silver as a punchline in the good times and a panic button in the bad, they are not neutral observers of this. They profit when you stay confused. They profit when a retiree who worked 40 years hears the word silver and thinks casino instead of insurance. The last thing they want is for you to understand that by the oldest measure this country ever wrote into law, the metal is cheap. Because an educated retiree is a customer they cannot churn. Let me pause here, because this is the point in the story where I owe you something practical, not just history. If what I am describing is making you look at your own retirement differently, you should know that the largest, most sophisticated buyers on the planet have already been acting on it. Central banks, the institutions that manage the reserves of entire nations, have been buying gold at a pace we have not seen in modern times. Roughly 1,000 tons a year for several years running, something close to double what they were buying the decade before. They are not doing that for excitement. They are doing it to protect themselves. And here is the part almost nobody tells the ordinary saver. There is a perfectly legal, perfectly quiet way for you to do the very same thing inside the retirement account you already have. You can move a portion of an existing 401k or an IRA into physical gold and silver, real metal, without triggering taxes and without paying a penalty, using what is called a self-directed precious metals IRA. This is not some loophole for insiders and the ultra-wealthy. If you have $100,000 or more in any retirement account, this was built for exactly your situation. If you are watching this on your television, just scan the QR code on your screen. If you are on your phone or your computer, go to jeffreedguide.com, and we will send you the free guide that walks through how it actually works. Then come right back, because the case only gets stronger from here. Now, let me stack the reasons the ratio is likely to matter, because a stretched number by itself is just trivia until you understand the forces pressing on it. Start with supply. Silver has run a structural deficit for several years in a row now. That means the world has been using more silver than it produces, year after year, drawing down the stockpiles that were built up in better supply decades. And unlike gold, which is hoarded, tucked into vaults, and passed down, silver is consumed. It gets used up. It goes into things and does not come back. That word, consumed, is doing a lot of work, so let me make it concrete. Silver is the best conductor of electricity there is, and it ends up in an enormous range of modern machinery, spread out in tiny amounts across billions of devices, circuits, panels, and connections. And here is the cruel little truth of it. When silver is scattered in fractions of a gram across a piece of electronics, it is almost never economical to recover. It is too dispersed, too cheap per unit to bother recycling out. So it is effectively gone, burned in the language of the market. Gold is hoarded. Silver is burned. That single distinction is one of the most important things a retiree can understand about why this metal behaves the way it does. Now, layer on the supply side of that equation, because it makes the deficit worse, not better. Most of the silver mined in the world does not come from silver mines. It comes out of the ground as a byproduct of digging for other metals entirely, the base metals of heavy industry. Which means that even if the price of silver were to climb sharply, the mining industry cannot simply flip a switch and produce a flood of new supply, because most of that supply is chained to the economics of completely different metals. Supply cannot respond quickly to price. Demand keeps drawing the stockpiles down. That is a setup that does not resolve gently. I want to stop and rehook you here, because this is the middle of the video, and the middle is exactly where the big banks are counting on you to drift off before you understand the whole picture. So stay with me, because here is the part that actually changes things. Everything I have described so far, the ancient ratio, the deficit, the burned silver, none of it is a secret in the way a conspiracy is a secret. It is hidden in plain sight, buried under noise, treated as boring by the very people who benefit from your not connecting the dots. And the dots, once connected, point somewhere specific. Look at how this ratio behaves under stress, because it tells you something. In moments of real fear, the gap between gold and silver has blown out to genuine extremes, moments where it took an almost unheard of number of silver ounces to equal 1 ounce of gold. And every single time it stretched to those extremes, it did not stay there. It snapped back, and it snapped back hard, with silver playing catch-up in violent fashion. Silver is the smaller, wilder, more volatile of the two metals. It falls harder when the mood turns dark, and it explodes higher when the mood turns. A A stretched ratio is a compressed spring. It does not tell you the exact day it releases, it tells you the tension is loaded. And consider where silver has actually reached in the past, because the ceiling people treat as impossible has already been touched. Twice in living memory, silver ran all the way up to around the $50 mark and stalled there. Once at the very start of the 1980s, and again decades later in the early 2010s. More than 30 years apart, the same rough level twice. The base of accumulation beneath that ceiling is by now something like 45 years long. That is an extraordinarily long runway. And here is the detail almost nobody mentions. That old peak, adjusted for everything that has happened to the value of the dollar since, would sit far, far above its plain nominal number today. Silver has never, in real terms, reclaimed the high it set nearly 2 generations ago. Not close. Which means the metal you think of as having already had its big run has in truth spent almost half a century failing to keep up with the erosion of the currency it is priced in. Now bring gold back into the frame, because silver does not move in a vacuum. Gold has been pushing into record territory, driven by exactly those central banks I mentioned, buying with an urgency that accelerated after the reserves of a major nation were frozen by other countries a few years back. That single event taught every finance minister on earth a lesson they will not forget. Gold that sits in your own vault, in your own country, cannot be switched off or seized by someone else's government. It is the one reserve asset that answers to no one. Gold has since climbed past other traditional reserves to become one of the very largest assets central banks hold, second only to the dollar itself. And every dollar of that gold buying widens the pressure on silver because it stretches the ratio further, and it advertises to the world that the smart money is quietly loading up on real metal. Which brings us to the actual claim in the title, stated plainly and honestly. Is a 3-figure silver price the fantasy the financial channels tell you it is? Let me be very careful here, because I will not insult you with a promise. Nobody can tell you what silver will trade for on any given day, and anyone who does is selling you something. But walk the logic. The ratio is stretched far past its historic norm. If it were merely to compress partway back toward where 2 centuries of American law and thousands of years of commerce said the two metals belong, and gold merely held near the elevated ground it has already taken, silver would not need to defy physics to reach a level that today sounds absurd. It would only need the oldest relationship in monetary history to reassert even a fraction of itself. That is the case serious analysts are actually making. Not a promise, not a date. A stretched ratio, a multi-year supply deficit, and a metal that is burned rather than hoarded. The number in the title stops being crazy the moment you stop measuring it against yesterday and start measuring it against 15 to 1. And now I need to tell you the part that matters most for how you should feel about all of this. You are early. That is the whole point. The central banks already know. The most sophisticated institutional money already knows, and it is already positioned. But the mainstream, the pension committees, the financial media that will one day run this story on the front page, they have not caught on yet. They are still treating silver as a joke and the ratio as trivia. And by the time it becomes obvious to all of them, by the time your neighbor is talking about it at the mailbox and every advisor in town is suddenly recommending it, the easy part will already be behind us. That is how these things always go. The recognition comes late, and it comes to a crowd. Nobody is going to call you on the phone and tell you the window is open. Nobody sends you an invitation to be early. You either see it now, quietly, while it is still boring, or you read about it later, loudly, after the move. But I owe you the honest caution, too, because I am not here to whip you into a frenzy. This is a case, not a guarantee, and nothing I have said is personal financial advice. Silver is volatile. It falls hard, sometimes for reasons that have nothing to do with the fundamentals. Sometimes just because a trading exchange raises the cost of holding a position and forces the leveraged crowd to sell. You have to be ready for that. Which means, if any of this speaks to you, own the real metal, and not a paper promise that someone else can fail to honor. Size your position so that a sharp drop can never force your hand, so you are never the frightened seller dumping into a shakeout because you needed the money next week. And whatever you do not sell into the panic. The people who lose in silver are almost always the ones who bought too much, too nervously, and got shaken out at the bottom. Own it calmly. Own it in a size you can hold through a storm, and let the long arithmetic work. So let me bring this all the way back to where we started. The number in the title made you flinch. Good. Now you know why it should not have. It only sounds crazy against the noise of the moment. Against the standard this country wrote into its very first money law, near 15 to 1, silver today is not expensive at all. It is cheap, stretched to a discount that history keeps telling us does not last. The crazy number is not the target. The crazy number is how far the ratio has already drifted from the natural order, and how few people are willing to say it out loud. If you have stayed with me to the end, you are exactly the person this last part is for. For those of you with $100,000 or more in a retirement account, I hold a free, no-obligation, one-on-one educational web conference. It is a real conversation, not a sales pitch, about how to think through protecting what you have built and whether moving a portion of it into physical metal inside your existing account makes sense for your situation. There is no fake urgency here, and I would never insult you with a fake deadline. But I will tell you the honest truth about timing. The moment to make a calm, unhurried decision is precisely the moment when nothing feels urgent, when the crowd is still asleep and the story is still boring. That moment is right now. Once it is obvious to everyone, the calm is gone, and so is the edge. If you are watching this on your television, scan the QR code on your screen. If you are on your phone or your computer, go to jeffreedguide.com and mention that you watched this all the way through. Take the quiet time you still have and use it well. Nobody is going to hand you an invitation. This is it.